I'd like to introduce Jim Bose, Jim Clark, Charlie Luce, and Toral Patel Wayman. They're with the U.S. Forest Service and Duke University, and they are going to present today on their work in reference to the comprehensive science synthesis of the effects of drought on forests and rangelands in the United States. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob, and welcome to all of you. Good afternoon to those of you in the East, and good morning to those of you in the West. We're really happy to present this webinar to you today and share with you some of the key findings from the synthesis that we've been working on over the past couple of years. What you're going to hear today is a combined presentation from the first three authors, from myself, from Jim Clark, and Charles Luce. Toral Patel was another key component to the project, a convening author, but she's unable to join us today. We are going to give about 45 minutes to an hour worth of a presentation to you, where we synthesize and sort of digest the synthesis and hit these key points. But we really hope and encourage that you utilize the question and answer session at the end, because we suspect that there will be a lot more information that you might be interested in that we just don't have time to cover in the hour or so that we have with you in the presentation part. So basically what we're going to provide to you is a summary of about a 300-page report that we led as convening authors, and we by myself, Jim Clark, Charlie, and Toral Patel. But really it was generated and built by experts from across the country. And so this general technical report has 77 authors from federal agencies, national labs, and universities. It was written over about a 2-year period, following a series of workshops and sessions where we got input from stakeholders about important topics, etc. We addressed several topics. As I said, it's about 300 pages, 12 chapters, and you can see those off on the right: characterizing drought, understanding physiological responses, looking at forest dynamics, processes like forest biogeochemical cycling and insects and pathogens, fire, a chapter on rangeland, detecting drought effects, ecological implications, and economic and societal characteristics. So as you can see, it was a very comprehensive and in-depth assessment of the variety of ecological, biophysical, and social and economic factors that are impacted by drought. And what we're going to give you today is some highlights from that, and won't be able to cover all topics in great depth. And so I encourage you to get this report. It's available online, and I think Dr. Barden sent a link out to you to how you could get it off the Forest Service website. Certainly, if you have any difficulty in finding it, please send any of us an email. I even have several hard copies that I would send you if for some reason you can't download it off the internet. But the details will be quite apparent in that report. In addition, the co-authors have taken at least a subset of some of the chapters and gone into some greater detail and greater focus and updated since the beginning of the report. And a lot of this information is also published in special issues of scientific journals. The Global Change Biology Journal has published 3 papers related to forest dynamics, fire, and biogeochemical cycling. And Forest Ecology Management is in the process with a special issue of publishing the topics on the right side: ecohydrology, characterizing drought, insects and pathogens, physiology, and monitoring drought. So you can also, if you're so inclined and want to see kind of individual, updated, and even more focused analysis of drought on these characteristics, you can go to the specific scientific journal and find those as well. And again, like the general technical report, which has everything, if you contact us, we can get some of this information to you. So a bunch of different places where you can get more information and more detailed information beyond what we give you this afternoon / this morning. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is kind of get started with the content of the report. And as I said, we're going to do this kind of in a round robin with the three of us taking on certain slides and certain topics. So the next slide will be discussed by Jim Clark.
Hello, this is Jim Clark. I'm going to assume I'm coming through unless I hear something somehow, first time on this software. I'm a forest ecologist at Duke University. I was sort of asked to participate in this process, which I was delighted to do. I'll join Jim Vos and Charlie in welcoming all of you, and just saying what an interesting process this has been to work with such a great group of both academic and agency scientists. I think we learned a lot, and so we'll give you kind of an overview of that today. The first issue here was just why do this sort of synthesis. Basically, the issues were to try to understand what are the changes that are going on now, what could we expect in the future, and are there things that we could do to anticipate some of the changes that would be useful from a management perspective. The motivation was, of course, the fact that we've seen this increase in frequency and intensity of droughts. Everybody's aware of this. We can expect more in this direction in the future, more extreme weather, rising temperatures on average. So this really motivated this effort to bring together some of the best experts we could find to get their inputs on what's going on now and what to expect. I think the Forest Service was interested in this because the changes that we can expect in forests are really different than what, or at least the impacts are very different than what we might expect in agriculture. Obviously, there's been a lot of effort to understand effects of drought in agriculture, and probably less so in forests, and it seemed like a good time to try to pull this group together. Part of what we wanted to do, the third bullet, was to see what the experts had to say about potential for managing, to look forward, how to adapt. Can we think about ways to increase resilience to climate change? So the group that I worked with included people that worked in the eastern, the western U.S. Obviously, one of the more profound impacts that we're all aware of is the large increase in wildfires in the west. On the right-hand side of this figure, the big changes here. If you look in the two bar graphs for the western U.S., different time periods, the large increase and essentially an index for drought impacts in the western U.S., not so much in the east, but big effect in the west. And on the left-hand side, a map of just some of the larger fires that we've experienced in this time period, and some of the ones that authors felt were particularly noteworthy. So this is a cause for concern. The impacts in forests, of course, are some of the large dieback events that have been pretty obvious in the West. Some of them involving fire, but others involving combinations of extreme weather and insect outbreaks. The impact of fighting large fires. The cost is another concern, and of course water supplies are another big issue. Again, I'm going to assume I'm coming through okay, unless maybe Bob or someone lets me know otherwise. The key messages then that are going to sort of come out of what we're going to talk about today, I think we'll all sort of hit on these, at least these three themes, is that first of all, it's pretty clear that the changes in climate that we've been seeing in the last few decades are really affecting all ecosystems. Obviously, we've been really influenced by some of the big changes in the West, but increasingly we're finding in the eastern U.S. that a lot of the mortality we find in forests, once you start to look at where that morbidity sets in, it's often related to extreme dry events. So it's not just the West where changes are going on. The effects are, some of them are fast, but some of them are pretty long-lasting. So obviously drought has a big impact on individual trees. One of the things that we understand best is how does an individual tree respond to things like drought effects. It's harder to understand things like what happens to whole stands and things like habitat shifts. So these are things that can be slower. Those are impacts that are hard to observe directly, but clearly are going on. The role of invasives. This really varies by region as to how important invasives are, but those are clearly influenced by climate. And also its effect on carbon and water. So these are additional impacts we'll be talking about. And then finally, the management issues. There probably are some things that we can do to help anticipate future changes, and that's something we want to talk about as well. I think it may be time to kick this over to Charlie, and so Charlie Luce will be the next one to talk, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm Charlie Luce. I'm a research hydrologist with the Forest Service in Idaho, and as a hydrologist working with ecologists, what I do commonly is describe how the hydrology can be characterized, how the different ways we can explain or model hydrology and forecast what it might be, and help relate that to what happens with the plants. Drought is conceptually a simple idea and definition, thrown up here as a rough approximation, a period of uncharacteristically dry weather for a given location. But it's complex in detail when you go to implement that in practice and say, is Nevada in a permanent drought? Well, no. We understand that Nevada is an arid place. It's not in some sort of permanent drought, but it has droughts. Wet places can have droughts too. Washington, North Carolina have certainly had droughts in the past, and even given that they are wet places, severe droughts can potentially be more crippling there. These are ecosystems that are potentially less adapted to dry weather. Drought, in a sense, is not supposed to be related to the seasonal or short term, but in a practical sense, we really do use that. We talked about the summer drought in much of the western U.S., where there's a Mediterranean climate, and the changes in that drought that differ in character as we go from year to year certainly can be described as a drought. So it gets a little complicated when you start seeing that way. I think just dropping back to this simple definition, saying this is a drier summer than usual, or something like that, would help explain that as being a drought in a sense. Vegetation can respond to drought over a period of weeks in a very strong way, or periods, years. Mild and low, sort of consistent drought can actually predispose plant responses. So it's important just to keep the different time scales in mind. When you get into some of the hydrologic literature on drought, not get too tied up in the definitions, and keep the fairly simple picture in mind. And to relate to that, I'll move on to the sort of definitions of drought types that are out there. Meteorological and hydrological are the ones that you find in the drought literature most commonly now. So meteorological drought are variations in precipitation and temperature. They may impute changes to evaporation, at least through the equations that are used, and typically you look at some kind of model of the soil moisture balance. Something like the Palmer Drought Severity Index, for instance, is a meteorological drought index. And it's a very simple evapotranspiration model based on temperature, just balancing against the amount of rainfall, and it sets it all into a simple couple of layers of soil to describe how there's an expectation between what the weather is doing and how the agricultural system might respond to that. In contrast, hydrological drought is an outcome, measurable, observable, and also modelable, outcome of a period of meteorological drought on stream flow or reservoir storage. So this is the outcomes to the hydrologic system. Certainly we can see various economic, social, and related impacts to that. So sometimes that's another definition that's put up here, is if you've had a period of hydrological drought, you may have a social outcome of that. The third type that I have up on this slide, ecological, is really just more coming into being. It's an emergent drought type, shall we say. And certainly we can see that there's a relationship between hydrological drought and ecological drought. We use tree rings to predict stream flow and reflect on when droughts might have occurred in the past. We understand there's that relationship in terms of outcomes. But now we're looking at outcomes of meteorological or hydrologic drought on forest, rangeland, or aquatic ecosystems. And here we're beginning to invoke the notion that there's a drought ecology, and some ecosystems might be drought adapted as well. So we are in any event, sorry, just had somebody walk in the office there for a second. So the ecological changes that we have in here are a response to this longer term drought change as well. So one of the questions we have is looking into the future. So we have drought and associated weather characteristics that might be changing over time. One of those, for instance, is the growing season rainfall. And we might be expecting lower growing season precipitation from climate change. I'll show a little bit on the next slide. But more importantly, and people might reflect on this more, less snow. One that's been brought up quite a bit is drier air and low humidity, and the modeling the impacts of that. If you just outright model the fact that you can have more evapotranspiration when the air is drier, and you do this without regard to the energy balance, you might project that the soil will be drier. It's not actually clear that that's going to be the case, because we do have to maintain an energy balance as well, and that could be the ultimate limitation on it. But there will be more acute stress on the plants and the vapor pressure handling pieces of that stomata. We can expect longer dry spells over many areas, and that's probably one of the stronger projections out there for climate change, with a reflection on what drought might do. We'll have higher temperatures during the drought. So droughts are periods that are hot already because there isn't that much evaporation going on, so there's not much cooling going on. And so now, in addition to just being hot during droughts, something that the plants have to suffer through, they're going to be suffering from higher temperatures or higher energy inputs. With respect to what's going on precipitation-wise, which we might think of as sort of a fundamental measurement of drought, there's actually quite a few questions. If we look at the seasonal projections here from GCRP, we look at the winter and spring, there's a lot of hatched area on here, pretty good expectation in those months anyway, that we might be moistening over the northern half and drying over the southwest, all related to large-scale circulation changes. But when we get into the growing season, it's a bit scattered. There's a few places on the map that show dry-ish more, and certainly in the fall months, September, October, November, September certainly being part of a big part of the fire season, really uncertain over a very large part of the continental U.S. So what we need to draw from this is noticing the amount of white area in here and the amount of area that's not hatched, and recognize that for the future right now, our climate models really are pretty fuzzy. And when you look at what the estimates are, even in the hatched areas, it's plus or minus 20% or minus 20% to 30%, plus 30%. So very uncertain projections. And as I mentioned, the change in the maximum number of consecutive dry days is increasing over quite a bit of this. So we might, as we have more intense storms, we're expecting maybe a bit more precipitation in some places, not necessarily so in the summer months, but that precipitation is going to come in more intense storms is the expectation, which means you're going to have a longer gap between things. And so we see over this changes in percentage of how long the gaps might be across there. So another important context for what might be going on drought-wise and how that might affect plants. And I will pass it here, and I think it's back to Jim Clark.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Yeah, so as Jim and Charlie said, we kind of led parts of this, and our group talked a lot about what the effects of drought would be on forest stands in all aspects. And so there's three main bullets I'll start with here. The first one is biodiversity. We know a whole lot about how drought affects individual trees of individual species. This is kind of the field we call ecophysiology. And we know enough about that to know that there's big species differences in how they respond to drought. So we can expect the composition of forests to change in the future. And there's quite a bit of evidence accumulating from both the empirical and modeling work that the ideal habitats or the habitats for species is actually changing. It's moving around and it's moving faster than species are moving. So in the term we can expect losses of species probably faster than we might acquire species better adapted to the new conditions. So species diversity is something we're expecting to change. The productivity of forests changes through demographic rates, how fast trees are growing, what their survival rates are, reproductive rates. All three of those aspects are affected by the weather, drought, and they're affected in different ways for different species. The effects on survival can be quick if there's a severe drought that causes dieback, but they can also be slow. They can be slow when morbidity sets in during a stressful period, and maybe years later we have tree death, but it may be difficult to attribute that event to a particular drought. But again, as I started off by saying, there's increasing evidence even in the East that drought can have a lot to do with the onset of morbidity in trees. Growth rates can respond rapidly, but they're harder to see. It requires a fair amount of monitoring to actually know that this is going on. Reproduction tends to affect productivity down the road. So if drought has differential effects on reproduction for different species, that has more impact on the productivity of future forests, but nonetheless it can be important by replacing, for example, fast-growing species with slow-growing species. Again, each of these effects differs by species, and it differs in terms of growth, survival, and production for each species. So there's quite a range of effects that drought can have. There can be a big impact on carbon sinks because essentially it depends on productivity. The big droughts in the Amazon basin, for example, in 2005, 2010, they're estimated to have had an effect on carbon sinks that's comparable in many ways to the annual emissions from fossil fuel combustion. So there was a big effect on growth So if you have drought effects that slow down growth of a large number of species, that affects how fast we take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in wood. But of course also if we have effects on survival, that can be a rapid return of carbon to the atmosphere. And then again, by affecting reproduction, that can affect productivity of future stands. One of the things that our group really spent a fair amount of time talking about is how do we get a better sense for these interactions that are involved with drought effects. So I'm just going to mention a few of these in the next two slides. One is the interaction between temperature and moisture. So if things warm on average, which they're doing at a very rapid rate, 2014 was a record warmth year globally. 2015 was a record warmth year. February 2016 was the warmest February on record. We're clearly in this trend of a warmer Earth. So Charlie pointed out some of the changes in precipitation. How do you put those two together when you're talking about stress on forests? Well, when things warm up, we can there's a lot of individual trees that can benefit from that, from a longer growing season, a longer period to accumulate carbon. But if it's coupled with longer, more severe droughts, we don't really know exactly how that trade-off works for most tree species. And it becomes more complicated when we try to talk about effects on stands, because of course if you have a detrimental effect on individuals of one species, what's that effect on its competitors? So the warming drought, the warming moisture interaction is a tough one that makes it hard to anticipate the future. A few more of these interactions. One of the things that, of course, you can have plenty of moisture-demanding species living in dry climates, so just because of the interactions between hydrology, drainage, and drought. Well, we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. For example, will these moist habitats be the future refuges? On the other hand, these are also the habitats that harbor many of the most moisture-sensitive species. So we could think about a number of ways this could play out, different for each species, and it's hard to anticipate how they'll work out. The rooting environment is something that we don't really understand very well, but it's an interaction with drought. Most models that look at the effects of drought on forests have something like a rooting depth that's specified in the model. And you could sort of think about putting rooting depth in a model as being like trying to summarize the population size of a city by talking about its diameter. We don't really know how different species exploit the soil environment, which makes it very difficult to model the effects of changing moisture availability on different species. The species interactions are a big deal. Obviously, we're all aware of the insect outbreaks that have been weather dependent and had a big impact on forests. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. Most of the pathogen natural enemies of trees depend in a very substantial way on moisture. So we can expect that disease relationships will be influenced by drought. Trees compete with each other. So as droughts emerge, it's hard to talk about the effect on a whole stand without knowing how it changes the relationships between trees and their competitors, other species. And then I've also listed a few others here, pollinators, seed dispersers. These are all things that are also sensitive to drought, and so the ultimate impact on forest stands is hard to generalize. Atmospheric CO2 is one that's of a lot of interest. Anything that has interactions with photosynthetic rates is affected by CO2. So water use, for example, is another one that's poorly understood in models. So those are some of the things we talked about. Let me turn it over to Jim Vos, who will pick up on the next slide.
I failed to introduce myself in any kind of depth there at the beginning, but let me just do that now. I'm Jim Vos, and I'm an ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. Most of what Jim had presented previously were some of the direct effects of drought on trees and forests. But a lot of the big scale and real major effects of drought often are what we would term secondary or indirect effects, things that occur as drought or warming or the combination begins to stress trees and change their resistance to these secondary or indirect effects. And one of the most obvious ones that certainly anyone living in the western United States has observed over the past couple of decades is insect outbreaks and drought. And you might think that this is pretty straightforward. The drier it gets, the more likely that insect outbreaks are going to occur. And for some insects and some species, that's true. But it's a bit more complex than that. The aggressive bark beetles, particularly mountain pine beetle, but also slightly less aggressive, the pinyon or the Ips beetle that hits pinyon pine, seem to be quite stimulated by severe drought. And it has been the primary cause of the widespread serious mortality that has occurred in lodgepole pine, in many lodgepole pine systems over the western U.S. and promoted that widespread outbreak. It's also allowed these insects to expand their range both latitudinally, so impact the forest in more northern latitudes than it ever would have before. Part of that is warming, but also the interaction of warming and drought, but also move up in elevation to impact trees growing at elevations that they'd never impact before. But moderate drought for a lot of species, tree species, seems to actually increase their resistance. So it's not just drought that necessarily will precipitate an insect outbreak, but it's also whether it's a low, moderate, or high severity. With moderate drought, actually in many tree species, stimulating a resistance response that makes insect outbreaks by bark beetles actually less effective or perform at a lower rate. It also depends on the type of insect. For example, on the bottom graph there, you see a hypothetical curve by the authors of this chapter that shows that the sap feeders seem to be most effective or most virulent at the moderate drought, whereas at the higher drought they're less, and that's because the sap is flowing less strongly, less effectively at those higher drought levels. So it depends not only on drought severity, but also varies among insect types. So again, just to reiterate, the response varies by insect type. As Jim alluded to, there's also some response to pathogens that depend quite a bit on the soil moisture or the moisture status of the environment that the pathogens are growing in. And so in this case, it depends on whether it's a primary or secondary pathogens. Primary pathogens that really require moist conditions would be expected to have a reduced performance under more drought or higher drought intensities. On contrary, though, pathogens that are considered secondary pathogens, and that is ones that seem to do better on weakened trees, and a lot of these are cankers or root rots, etc., do better under high drought because the trees are weakened and they can take advantage of their weakened defensive. So some pathogens are more harmful under drought, but others are less harmful under drought conditions. Also has been discussed before, but I'll just add to this quite a bit because this is obviously a big deal, is wildfire. We have seen in the news, all of us, and maybe have experienced it personally, an increase in fires, and both in frequency and in size. Severity is a much more complex response to drying conditions, very, very locally determined, dependent upon microsite, fuel condition, and soil moisture, fuel moisture, etc. And it might be really only the most severe drought conditions where you get some more uniform or predictable effects on severity, but certainly frequency and size have increased dramatically. And this has had a really big impact on the investment required to fight fires. For example, the 2015 fire season was the costliest on record for the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service spent about $1.71 billion fighting fires after these severe droughts in that year and preceding years. And in fact, during 1 week, there was an expenditure of about $1.6 million per hour. So the suppression costs are astronomical under these severe drought conditions. And part of that is related to the fact that this increasing frequency and size of fires means that there's more likely to be vulnerabilities in the wildland-urban interface, and that greater risk requires a greater response, and a greater response requires a greater cost. I think a sobering fact is that if you begin to look at the potential projections of changing weather, drying conditions, warmer conditions, the annual area burned, as bad as it is now, or as bad as it's been over the last several years, is projected to increase by over 200% in many areas of the western U.S. And so the take-home message here is that while things appear to be and are challenging to natural resource managers now, the future portends even greater challenges in the future. Greater suppression costs, greater risks to the wildland-urban interface, and a real need to think about management options to deal with these dramatically changing conditions. The other thing about all of these indirect effects is that they don't occur singly. That they occur in combination. So it's not just that you have an insect outbreak in drought. Often you have an insect outbreak combined with drought, combined with fire risk, combined with other challenges. And this makes our ability to both predict and manage in anticipation or in response to these disturbances incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging. This is an example of some of those stress complexes for southern pine forests, and there's similar ones that in greater detail in Chapter 7 of the report as well. But here, for example, you have a situation where you have a global change or global warming, more severe hurricanes, sea level rise, drought and warmer temperatures impact upland forests, more flammable fuels, hurricanes and sea level rise impact coastal forests, more dead fuels, more stand replacing fires of larger size, more wildfire threatening the wildland interface. In the eastern U.S., where you have significant air quality constraints on, say, using prescribed fire, you have some challenges to managing that, but also health risks, and then other species conversions that are happening in response to these altered disturbance regimes. The take-home message here is that it might be fairly straightforward to come up with management strategies when you have one thing going on at the same time, but in reality, in all regions of the United States, the future portends this combination of stresses, these stress complexes, which make it certainly much more difficult to deal with. The other components of the assessment and report is that we not only looked at sort of the physical characteristics of the changes to the forest, but also how drought might infect processes. How might it impact nutrient cycling? How might it impact carbon cycling? How might it impact hydrologic cycling? I'd like to just summarize a few of the key messages from those process-based efforts. First is nutrient cycling, and the take-home message here, and certainly one of the reasons why productivity can be substantially impacted by drought, is that water stress essentially equals nutrient stress. And that when you have less water in the soil, when you have less water moving through the trees, perhaps dieback of roots and above ground components, you begin to get reduced nutrient uptake, a premature leaf loss, declining microbial activity, so a slower cycling of many of the processes required to provide available nutrients to the trees. And so the double whammy is that not only is there a reduction in the water available for tree growth and productivity, but also a reduction in the nutrients available for tree growth and productivity. And then kind of the big impact is when you have severe and large fires, and you can lose a substantial amount of nutrients in smoke that just is consumed as the forest floor burns and fires, but also anything that might happen as a result of post-fire erosion as that surface carbon on the forest floor erodes into the stream systems or off-site. So a combination of changes in uptake and cycling within the system, but also perhaps big pulse losses due to emissions and post-fire erosion. Carbon cycling, as Jim Clark talked about, is that you can get some pretty big losses in pulses as a result of losses with severe fires, but also that lower growth as a result of drought and nutrient stress reduces carbon uptake, and higher mortality, of course, reduces carbon uptake as well. So some substantial potential changes in carbon cycling that can be very long-lasting. This is one of the key differences between impacts in forest and range systems versus impacts in agriculture, is when you have a drought in the agricultural system, while tragic and certainly important economically, and you lose a crop for a year or two, with forests, the impacts can be very long-lasting and may take decades or even centuries to recover from as a result of things like reduced growth or increased carbon loss due to higher mortality. And then the final one process, which I'll spend a little bit more time talking about, and that's the impacts of drought on ecosystem processes related to hydrology. And the impacts on the hydrologic cycle are much more than just how it impacts stream flow, because that stream flow is really determined by how that incoming precipitation interacts with the existing vegetation, with the soil, and with groundwater, and with in-stream processes to eventually influence the relationship between precipitation inputs and both water quantity and water quality. And water quality is especially impacted by drought in that those lower flows can concentrate sediment and concentrate nutrients. And also lower flows can result in much warmer stream water as well. So in places where you may be on the edge of a cold water tolerant fishery or aquatic system, those lower flows typically will increase the stream temperature and lower water quality, and can have some pretty significant impacts on water quality as well. The access to groundwater can have a big impact on that relationship between precipitation input and stream flow as well, places that are dominated or where the stream flow is dominated by groundwater may be somewhat buffered and be less responsive to changes in precipitation than those that where the stream flow is heavily influenced by the surface water storage, deep soil water storage as well. But what I'd really like to talk a little bit more about is the relationship between the vegetation characteristics and how ecosystems respond hydrologically to drought. As Charlie alluded to in the introductory slides there, beginning slides, there's a couple of definitions of drought. One is atmospheric drought, which is a deficit in precipitation. The other is hydrologic drought, which is a deficit in stream flow. If we were talking about a parking lot, the relationship between those two would pretty much be 1-to-1. If you got reduced precipitation input, you'd expect a comparable decline in stream flow. But in forested systems, the relationship is not necessarily 1-to-1 because the watershed characteristics, the biological, in this case the species, tree species, and their water use requirements, but also the physical characteristics interact with that precipitation and may make one particular system more or less vulnerable to changing drought regimes than another. So it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 relationship. That precipitation is moderated by the existing vegetation on the watershed or on the stand. And this graph here just shows sort of that variation, at least in a diverse eastern deciduous forest ecosystem. This is from a forest in North Carolina. And what you see here, all these dots are very different amounts of growing season water use required by the types of species that occupy that stand. So for an example, at a kind of a medium-sized tree, let's say 50 centimeters, the amount of daily water required by trees ranges from about 15 kilograms up to 160 kilograms. So, you know, a 10 to 15-fold difference. And so those species will then interact with that precipitation input and moderate or influence how it's affected hydrologically. In addition to different amounts of water required by these species, there's also very different sensitivities to drought. Some species are much more likely to be impacted and may die from drought than others. Typically, it's these higher water-using species, the ones that are the diffuse porous ones in the upper part of the graph, that are much more vulnerable to drought and likely to die as a result of drought than the ring porous or tracheid species, which are the lower water-using species in the bottom part of the graph. So essentially, systems that have a lot of the diffuse porous, high water use species are more vulnerable, and over time with a lot of droughts, these systems may adjust to more water use efficient or more drought tolerant species just as the competitive interactions of these different species play out. Okay, what I'd like to do now is then switch it over to Charlie Luce, who will talk about drought effects on rangelands.
Thanks, Jim. The last slide moves very well into this. So we have rangelands, which are usually associated with a different set of plants, shrubs, woodland species, as opposed to continuous forests, and grasses. The general stories that we can get are twofold for rangelands. They're a bit different than the forests. Range ecosystems and management tend to be more responsive to weather than we typically associate with forests. And the second point is that much of the area that is in range is generally projected towards drier conditions overall, particularly more in the southwest than towards the Midwest. So if we're looking at the Midwest, we're projecting largely damper conditions as opposed to the southwest. When we want to look at the sensitivity of how things have progressed in the past, so just learning from what we have seen, what we see here is actually probably not too far different from general expectations. The first story here, when we look on the left picture, is we see drying. The weather trends are towards drier in the southwest and a little bit damper in the more midwestern or plain states. That's a general expectation as well as the projections. The drying over this period in the southwest has been reflected in the projection on the right-hand side, reflected in the vegetation, which we see from NDVI. So the southwest, and this is through 2012, so Texas in particular is showing quite a strong impact in here. But the upshot there is that these rangeland plants are sensitive to what's going on, and sensitive at short time scales. So range managers have for quite a long time taken a look at what the weather's been doing and taking a look at what the vegetation looks like in order to figure out how to manage the animals on those lands. In one sense, these rangeland plants are well adapted to drought because it is a more common visitor in these places. In another sense, they're more vulnerable to it because they're at the edge of very dry places. And a good thing to remember is that grasses have very different water handling than trees and woody shrubs. So what's going on with those may be a bit different. And just this sense of vulnerability for the forests, when you look at the forest maps of the United States and the vulnerability of those droughts and projections for those, a lot of the southwest forests and woodlands show up as being a bit more sensitive. In terms of general rangeland impacts, pretty straightforward story there. Reduced vegetation cover, increased erosion, some of that being wind erosion. So we might see, and have seen from the historical trends so far, more deposition on snowpack in some of the southern Rockies. Loss of moist microsites related to that, very important for things like sage grouse. And loss of the seasonal changes will also, as Jim alluded to, affect the species composition. There will be some advantages for invasives, things like cheatgrass, for instance, depend on wildfire or benefit from wildfire. So if we're going to see potentially increased wildfire in this area, we might see some advantages for that. And as I said, reduced tree cover, particularly in the southwest. We're seeing some of the stronger challenges in that area. And move from there, the next speaker will be Jim Clark.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. So looking forward to the future kind of brings us back to the motivations for the assessment. What are the changes going on now? What could we expect in the future, and is there anything we can do about it? So I have a slide each on trying to detect or understand what's happening now. One on prediction or anticipating changes that could occur, and then some management implications. So one of the first things that we spent a lot of time talking about is really just how to know that changes are going on in forests. It's not as easy to tell as it is in agricultural systems or even rangelands. You tend to have impacts that may not show up for years to come, and even then be hard to attribute to things like drought. It's hard to see drought effects in forests from remote sensing. Stand dieback is obviously easy, but there's an awful lot of effects that happen that are not so easy to detect. To do this on the ground, of course, is labor intensive. There's a fair amount of discussion about this, though, and some of the ideas that people thought about was obviously the FIA network of trees, which is currently difficult because of the potentially long census interval between plots, but nonetheless, that goes on and could provide information on changes at sort of the 3 to 10 year scale is probably a good way to put it. There's also a number of long-term demographic plots. More of these are going in all the time, often run by ecologists. And NEON, the NEON network, is planning to recensus their plots annually. So ground monitoring is intensive. It takes a lot of work. It's expensive, but that's one of the ways that we might think about getting a better sense for what the changes that are happening now. It's not the case that we can just put more detail in models and get better predictions. There was a lot of discussion in our group about the different kinds of models that are being used to understand climate effects on forests. If there are things we know now that could be put into those models that would make them better. And I think most of the discussion focused on the fact that we're missing some pretty key elements. The first bullet here is just the understanding the environmental conditions that will be driving changes in forests. And of course, one of the things that Charlie and Jim have both emphasized is the uncertainty in future precipitation. But there's also a lot of things that foresters and ecologists study that we don't know well enough to put them in models to predict the future. Obviously, extreme events, because they're extreme, are very hard to quantify or predict their impacts. They're rare events and are hard to estimate. I mentioned before the rooting zone, and that's one of the things that has just been hard to study, and so we've tended to not learn as much about it as we would need if we were going to get serious about predicting impacts of drought on future forests. I mentioned interactions, species interactions, and also these combinations of variables that affect forests. We've learned a lot about many of these variables individually and primarily at the scale of individual trees. We don't have nearly enough studies where we look at those individual scale effects at the same time that we're looking at stand level effects. This is harder to do because it means you've got to study the whole stand at the same time you're studying the individual trees. But nonetheless, if we don't do that, we can't simply take parameters for how an individual tree responds and put it into a model for how a forest responds. Management obviously is something that we all care a lot about. So the report comes back to some of these direct effects quite a bit. Growth, reproduction, mortality, demographic rates, how they can each respond differently to drought. We primarily manage these responses through essentially managing species, density, and there was a third one. Reproductive environments. So those are the three ways that we tend to manage for these. With drought, of course, we have to treat those things differently, looking for species that might hedge our bets against dry conditions in the future. By doing that, maybe managing also stocking levels, density in ways that will hedge against future mortality, and also modify the way in which stand regeneration is handled, either through different techniques, different species, different genotypes, and so forth. In terms of the indirect effects, obviously if we know a lot about weather and we know a lot about fuels, we know quite a bit about fire risk and even a fair amount about fire behavior. We can't really say that for insects and pathogens, and some of these could be known much better than they are if they were studied specifically in the context of drought and its potential impacts on forest stands. So those are areas that we could really do much better. The impacts on water supply, Jim talked about that already. Obviously, different species use different amounts of water. Different stocking levels affect water yield, so those are obviously things to think about as well. And even thinking creatively maybe about different ways of managing stands. Again, size, density, species, probably the three variables that are most often manipulated. This was kind of an interesting study that just came out 2 years ago from Tony D'Amato's group, pointing out a situation where you could think about the lowest vulnerability to drought being at intermediate stocking levels, this blue area with both the highest stock stands, a high density, high basal area being at risk, but also some of the more open stands being at risk just simply because of the way that individual trees can respond to moist periods that then put them at risk when droughts come along. And I think that could be time for me to pass this off to Charlie. Well, no, I've got one more slide here. Okay, and basically just summarizing some of those issues. So there are some management things to think about. How do we manage density? It may take some new perspectives to think more about this when we're trying to think about droughts as kind of episodic events. Thinking about drought-resistant species, or at least species that are not likely to suffer catastrophically when droughts do occur. The whole idea that if we're thinking about variability in weather and climate, that is, climates that vary through time, diversity can be a hedge, and if that's the case, maintaining higher diversity stands to hedge against potential drought, and maybe that involves something of a trade-off with productivity. It may not be the stand that would maximize production in a given climate, but it may allow us to do better on average given the climate varies. So I think now let me pass this off to Charlie.
Thank you, Jim, and particularly thanks for taking that last slide. Forests really grow where precipitation falls, and so the relationship between forest and water supply is strong. It's where a lot of our water comes from across the United States. And consequently, there's a demand to manage forests relative to various kinds of water supply and water quality. Some of that's water supply for drinking, agricultural sources, but also, in a sense, the water supply and quality for the most threatened fishes, for instance, those fishes that depend on the coolest, highest quality water. So there's quite a range of tasks there. There are a few suggestions about that, and because of this demand, a few things to discuss. The fire risk, for instance, we have water managers coming to us and wanting us to control the fires in our watersheds upstream of their water intakes. And that can be a very difficult, expensive, and unreliable sort of approach to managing these. We can reduce risk to some extent, but when things get really dry, it can be still very difficult. We can encourage water managers, on the other hand, to diversify sources. Again, diversity is an important thing here, and it turns into a reliability engineering problem. And when we look at the biggest cities, they often have a separate groundwater source. Certainly, the largest cities tend to rely pretty strongly on surface water supplies. Places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, all surface water supply, Denver. But a lot of them also have groundwater backups for that, for the brief time that they're threatened by post-fire. Riparian positions and riparian forests are some of the most influential on the stream water quality and also quantity, because these are trees with their roots in the water even during the driest periods. And while there's a temptation to say we need to protect these in order to protect the water quality, again, ultimately there will come a time that's dry enough that things will burn. And if the ecology is maintained, there's a hope that the connectivity of what eventually might be a fire or other impact to these systems will be limited. It'll be broken up in there. So maintaining the riparian ecology is probably, and how it ties to the broader upslope landscape is probably a more important thing to consider. Sometimes people suggest that we harvest the trees and keep low densities of trees for the purposes of water augmentation downstream. Not, as Jim was just mentioning, in order to keep the most resilient stands, but saying we want more water downstream. Unfortunately, it's a temporary, minor, unreliable, even more so in drought years, fix for that solution. There's not a lot of response to forests in the driest years in terms of producing more water. Encouraging conservation, again, encouraging diverse inputs are probably the best ways. Going back and thinking through it as an engineering problem, yeah, no bias there, but as a hydrologist with an engineering background, but just saying that there's some different ways of dealing with it than what we might be encouraged to do as forest managers often. Information is probably one of our most reliable sources for managing water supplies for drought. So keeping track of what's going on in the forest, what the snow supply looks like, is a very good predictor of the oncoming dry season. And responding intelligently to the changing conditions, realizing when fires are going to happen, and helping people plan around the weather coming in for those and what they might produce for bad water quality. So to finish up for the presentation, I'll return to the key messages that Jim gave us at the beginning. So drought is now affecting all ecosystems, and it could get worse in some key ways. Temperature impacts, for instance, were brought up. Changes so far have been most obvious in the west. Impacts in the eastern forest may occur through morbidity and slow decline. Could be a very different way that drought affects those forests and how that drought changes in the future. But ultimately, drought is one of the most challenging times for our forests. The impacts are both immediate and long-lasting. We can lose trees pretty rapidly to plant stress. Having drought tolerance can help that. We may see habitat shifts, or at least the mix of species may change very slowly over time. And one of the big concerns is that, and as brought up in rangelands, some invasive species can benefit from this changing ecology. The reduced carbon storage, which is trees, and reduced water supplies are both, in the context of changing drought, can be a grave concern as well coming into the future. And overall, for the discussion on how do we manage this, it's to increase the resilience and the resistance to drought, leaning very heavily on the resilience given the large acreages involved. And with that, I think we get to move to questions.
All right, thank you guys for the great presentation. At this time, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat window, and we'll work our way through them. The first question we have is, what is the key difference between moderate and severe drought?
Well, I guess if we're going to start with the hydrologic side of that, if you look at sort of the drought monitor sources for that information, it has to do with how long it's been dry and what the temperatures have been during that period. And that goes into a calculation of the Palmer Drought Severity Index. That may or may not relate to what really is severe or moderate with respect to how the trees experience that drought. So just trying to understand the connection of the question there, but assuming that they're looking at the drought monitor reports and then going from there, what Jim Vos and Jim Clark both discussed is how those different levels of drought or natures of drought might affect forests, and those may not jive as well as we'd like.
Okay.
So let me also just add another point, Charlie, and we mentioned